Welcome to the 17th video in our series of quilts and projects using 5-inch squares or charm packs. I'll be making 2 samples, each using 1 charm pack and a border print. This charm pack is from the Paper Hamlet line of fabric by Moda, designed by Kathy Holden. The center of the quilt will just be squares, 6 across and 7 down, so just start by sewing 2 squares together and then make rows of 6. You will have 7 rows of 6 squares. This charm pack does have some directional prints, so I'm going to be careful that they're all facing the same direction. You don't necessarily have to have them all face the same direction. Because of the border print, you could have it be random and face any of the directions where they just happen to end up. The only thing I'm trying to do with the sets of 2 is to not sew the same color of fabric to each other. I'm just trying to mix up the colors and the designs. Now that my sets of 2 are sewn together, I'm going to pick 3 at a time and sew them into a row of 6 squares. I'm just trying to make sure that each row has a variety of designs and colors. I'm also making sure that each of the fabrics in each row is facing the same direction. The center of the quilt will go together pretty quickly. That's the wonderful thing about using pre-cuts, is it's all pre-cut for you so you can go straight to the sewing. Once all the rows are sewn together, I'm going to lay it out and decide the order of the rows. The second charm pack I'm using is called Radiant by Amaryllis Henderson. This charm pack had more duplicate prints, so I sorted them out into sets of 6 before I started sewing the rows together. And then I sewed 1 row at a time. So just a slightly different method than the first set of charms. If you want to make this with a border print that doesn't have a matching charm pack, you can use scraps from your stash and make your own 5-inch squares. Now it's time to press. For the Paper Hamlet set, I'm going to press rows 1, 3, 5, and 7 to the left and rows 2, 4, and 6 to the right. When I sew the rows together, this will alternate the direction of the seam allowance so the seams will nest together. A long time ago, when I was a new quilter, I thought pressing was a waste of time, but I have learned over the years that pressing is what makes everything lay nice and flat and can make the difference between whether your pieces fit together or they don't. For these rows, I'm pressing from the back side because I think it's a little bit easier, but you could also press from the front side. You could also press all of these seams open if you prefer. I like to press them to alternate sides so that I can nest them together. If you press them open, then you have to pin, and I prefer to nest the seams instead of pinning. Everyone gets to decide their own personal preference. Fabric, as you can see, leaves a lot of lint on surfaces. I keep a lint brush handy so that in between pressing, I can run the lint brush along there, collect all that lint, and then it won't deposit on the next set. Once your rows are pressed and you've laid them out in the correct order, it's time to start sewing them together. You can either just mark the top row so that you know where you started and where you need to keep going, or you can mark each row 1 through 7. Whatever method works for you to keep it in order. You can pin your rows together if you desire, but I usually just start and then sew a little ways before I stop, rearrange the fabric so all the raw edges are lining up, and then just keep going. I'd have to stop to take out the pins, so I kind of see this as you're going to stop every so often anyway, so I might as well not bother pinning and just use that time to rearrange the fabric so that all the edges line up. Once all the rows are sewn together, press the seams in one direction. You can press from the back side or you can press from the front side. Some of the corners will be a little bulky, but you can also press these seams open if you want to prevent that. The important thing is to not skip the step of pressing. Your quilt will lay a lot flatter when you press. The centers of each of these quilts will be 27.5 inches by 32 inches at this point. Do not worry if your measurements are off a little bit from that, it's all going to work out in the end. This particular pattern idea is a little more forgiving than some. The Radiant line of fabric didn't have a border print that went with it, but I had found a print by In the Beginning Fabrics, a border print that I thought matched perfectly. I love it when fabrics from two different fabric companies work perfectly together. For this quilt, I started with the charm pack and 1 2/3 of this border print. To determine how much border print to purchase, it depends on two factors: the size of the center of the quilt and the width of the border print. The center of this quilt is 27.5 inches by 32 inches, and the width of the border print, once cut into 4 separate lengths, is no wider than 10 inches. I took the largest measurement for the center, which is 32 inches, and added 20 inches, which is at least 10 inches for each side. So that ends up being 10 inches for one side, 32 inches for the center, and then 10 inches for the other side, for a total of at least 52 inches. I rounded up another 8 to 10 inches to get the right length to purchase. So I needed a total of 1.2 yards of this print. I trimmed all of the border pieces to be exactly the same, and they ended up being 9 inches across. I trimmed mine so the blue band would be an inner border. I could have also had it as an outer border with a little tiny blue in the middle, but I decided I liked the blue on the inside, and then I will put a dark blue binding on it and use that light blue as a flange. The Paper Hamlet line of fabric has a border print, although it's just on the two sides and it has blue plain in the middle. I ended up purchasing 4 yards of this fabric, and I'm going to make the border a little bit wider, and then I'll use the plain blue in the center for my binding. The nice thing about these wider prints is that you can make a much bigger project. I cut the 4 yards into two 2-yard pieces, and then I cut the selvage off both sides of the fabric. I lined up the raw edges and pinned them together so they wouldn't shift. This is 2 yards of fabric. I've got the raw edges together, and I've folded it so that I'm cutting through 4 layers at once. I had already decided that I wanted the blue of the border print next to the center of the quilt. It'll kind of read as a border around that center. I had also decided I wanted these borders to be about 15 inches wide. When determining how much of this fabric to buy, I had to take that center measurement, the longest one, which was 32 inches, and then I had to add 30 inches, 15 inches for each side, to get a total of 62 inches at least. So I added another 8 to 10 inches, which brings it right around 72 inches. So I purchased 4 yards, which gives me a 2-yard piece for the top and bottom and a 2-yard piece for the sides. The bonus for this is that center fabric that I'm not using, the blue, I can cut that down and use it for my binding. We're just making small quilt tops today, but you can add a border stripe to any quilt top. The formula for that is longest measurement plus 2 times the width of the border stripe plus about 10 inches. For example, if your center is 50 inches by 70 inches and your border stripe is 10 inches wide, your formula would be 70 plus 20 plus 10, which equals 100 inches. And that's right around 3 yards, which is 108 inches, so I would just round up to 3 yards. For this pattern, I love how this blue section is going to create a border around the center section. And I'm using one of the sections from the center as my binding, and I'll have the other one left over to use in another project. Now it's time to add the borders to the quilt tops. There are many ways to add a mitered corner to a quilt top. This is the method I use, and it doesn't involve any rulers. Just a simple fold of the fabric, an iron, and some pins. Start by sewing 2 of the border strips to opposite sides of the quilt top. Center it so that you have the same amount of fabric hanging off the quilt top on both sides. I'm going to try to center the blue fans on the corners. It's important to pin the border into place. Start with a pin in the center and move towards the corners. I'm going to use the first side to help me line up the second side. Once it's pinned, it's time to sew it into place. We're going to sew the 2 side seams before we add the other 2 borders. On the wrong side of the quilt top, draw a dot with a marking pen or a pencil a 1/4 inch away from the edge on both sides. Mark this dot on all 4 corners of the quilt top. Sew the opposite borders to the quilt top. You want to start on that dot and end on the dot. I usually will start a little away from the dot, backstitch to the dot, and then sew my seam and do the same thing on the other end. You want to make sure that you're not sewing all the way to the end of the fabric. You need to have that 1/4 inch that's not sewn down. It does seem like there's a lot of extra fabric on each end, but you're going to need that when it comes time to put the miter in. When adding the border to the paper hamlet quilt top, I wanted to make sure that each side only had 1 moon, so I was a little careful about how I added these borders to the quilt top. The only recommendation I would have would be to make sure you have at least 15 inches on each side for the miter. Once you've sewn the borders onto opposite sides of the quilt top, press away from the center of the quilt. Now it's time to add the last 2 borders and miter the corners. Make sure the fabrics overlap on each corner. For this version, I centered the design similar to what I did on the other 2 borders. It's not going to center perfectly, but I'm going to get it as close as I can. Make sure to pin the border in place before you get to the sewing machine. For sewing on these last 2 borders, you want to do the same method as the first 2 borders. Start on the dot and end on the dot. For some added stability at the corner, I did do some back stitching at both the start and finish of the seam. It's important to take your time to sew the border stripes onto the quilt edge carefully. Don't try to rush it. Be careful and deliberate. It will all pay off when you're putting the mitered corner in. At the corner, the stitch line for both corners should meet right on that dot. Now it's time to do the 45-degree fold at the corner. Lay one of the borders flat and then fold the other one so the right sides are together, matching up the raw edges of the border stripe. This can be a little bit tricky. It's not hard, but it does take a little bit of practice. For the fabric that hangs off that corner, you want to pin that together so it doesn't shift as much. Press it into place to create a crease in the top piece of fabric. This crease will be your sewing line. Once it's pressed, make sure you pin carefully. What I have found that works best for me is if I pin in the crease line and then pin the border pieces all around to kind of stabilize everything. Repeat the process on the other end. It will be a mirror image of the first end. Take your time getting this folded right, pressed right, and pinned right. Your seam will turn out better for it. You'll repeat this on the other side of the quilt for the other two corners. Now it's time to sew the seam. I usually start from the very corner and sew into that center dot. All I'm doing is sewing right on that crease line. If you wanted to, you could mark it with a pencil or a marking pen to make it easier to see. We only have 4 more seams to finish this quilt top, and we'll have a spectacular finish on the outer edge. Be careful with the last 4 seams. Take your time to sew it right. When I'm done sewing the seam, I'm going to check it to make sure I've got it nice and flat, and then I'm going to trim the seam down to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You could also trim it down to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I just like to have a little extra fabric in there. Press the mitered seam open, and then the seam from the center of the quilt should go right into the border print. Once all the corners are done, give it a final pressing so that everything is nice and flat. If you've sewn the corners correctly, your border print should lay flat and not have a ruffle to it. Take the time to press it really well. And here's the finished quilt. I used warm and natural batting and a cuddle fabric for the back. The blue makes a nice inner border, so I picked a blue fabric for the binding also. That little bit of light blue all around the edge gives the illusion of a flange without having the trouble of having to put in a flange. I really love how the border really makes this quilt top pop. I used white thread for the quilting and a loop design for the pattern. The finished size is 47.5 by 52 inches. For the quilt top that has the larger borders, I'm using the same method. It just takes a little bit more work because the borders are wider. Remember, mitered corners aren't hard. You just need to practice. And normally I'd skip showing you the technique on the second sample, but for mitered corners, I'm making an exception. Feel free to skip ahead if you've got it. Once finished, this quilt measured 57 inches by 62.5 inches. I used a minky fabric for the backing and warm and natural for the batting. I used a light blue thread for the quilting, and I did it in a stipple pattern. I had loved this border print since the moment I saw it, and I'm so glad I got to make a project using it. The blue fabric on the edge for the binding was the perfect way to finish it off. And there is some leftover fabric, and you end up with these funky cuts left over from making the mitered corners. So you could just put them in your scrap pile, but of course I decided I had to make something using them. I decided to just sew the leftover pieces together and make pillows to match each of the quilts. I sewed the pieces together and kind of got an X design. I layered that piece together with some batting and then quilted it. I used the leftover blue from the other quilt and some more leftover batting and quilted that up to use for the back side of the pillow. Once I had the top and the back made, I put them together, sewed all the way around, leaving an opening so I could turn it right side out. I haven't stuffed it yet, but here is the finished product laying flat on my table. The pieces that were left over from the paper Hamlet version were a little bit larger, so I did something a little different with those. I pieced the sections together and made 2 squares, so each square has 4 pieces. I layered them with batting, no backing, and then I marked the batting for the quilting lines. Once they were quilted, I cut the largest circle I could out of one of them and then sewed it to the other one. I had right sides together, and I'm just using a 1/4 inch seam allowance with my walking foot all the way around the circle. I have found that if I start off the edge of the project, sew the seam all the way around, and then sew off the project at the end, when I turn it right side out and I have to put that seam on the inside to sew all the way around for top stitching, it stays in place a little bit easier. For doing square pieces, you have to clip the corners, and for doing round objects like this one, you need to clip the seams so it has little give all the way around. I also like to do a top stitching all the way around the edge of the quilt. That way I don't have to hand sew that little bit that stayed open so you could stuff it. And I just like the way it looks all the way around the edge of the pillow. I could have also put zippers in these projects so that I wouldn't have to stuff them. I could use a pillow form instead. For the quilting on all these projects, I just used a variegated thread and my walking foot. If you enjoyed our video, we hope you'll remember to give us a thumbs up, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!